One of the most uncomfortable feelings for a human being is watching another person in distress. It is Accessibility is literally the ability to access one's capability to get from A to B in their current environment. When we discuss access, we generally think about it in terms of movement or a physical sense, but it is so much more than that. If we think of access in terms of entry, then we can start to identify and appreciate the barriers to access that exist. For example, entry into a building or room, entry into an interaction, entry into an opportunity. Let's start with what is frequently the most obvious: physical access due to architectural barriers. How far is the entry from the parking or drop-off? But it isn't only the distance that should be considered. What is the terrain like? Not all individuals with impaired mobility use a wheelchair, and even those that do might find uneven surfaces a challenge. Is the terrain suitable for those who might be unsteady on their feet? And if there is a ramp, is the gradient suitable enough for a gradual climb? Because not all wheelchair users have full function of their arms. Another barrier to accessibility is communication. This is not only about what format of communication is used, but providing alternatives so that an individual has a choice and doesn't have to make a specific request. Understanding what an individual's requirements are can remove anxieties and ensure efficient and effective communication. For example, one of the neurodiverse team members in my organisation requires that all important information in an email or communication for his attention is written in bold and underlined. It is the visual stimulus that his brain requires in order to draw his attention to the need to retain that detail specifically. He informs anyone who he works with that this is the case, and as a result, they adapt their communications appropriately. Regularly, adaptations made out of necessity can benefit a majority as everybody has a preference, and this can lead to greater efficiency within the workplace. Organisational barriers follow on well from this, as often there are processes in place that allow for little flexibility. How often is the answer to a query words to the effect of, "We've always done it this way," "The system can't accommodate this deviation," or even, "There's not enough demand for that, so it doesn't make sense to implement it," i.e., it will cost too much time or effort. Thankfully, this type of barrier is becoming less common as a result of increased legislation and empathy towards difference and specifically towards disability. However, it is important to have awareness of the fact it still exists and reframe our thought process to include probing questions such as, why can't it be modified? Is it necessary that we still do it like that? How could this be adapted to enable more people? Many individuals with a disability navigate the world and workplace using technology to enable them to operate efficiently and independently. This can become a barrier if compatibility is an issue that is unable to be resolved. In order to support workers with disabilities, it is important to have awareness of the scope in which barriers to accessibility can exist. Communication is simply the exchanging of information in some shape or form. We naturally think of it as speaking and listening, but it is so much more than that, and this means that regularly the many barriers to communication are overlooked. Not necessarily intentionally, but more likely because we take them for granted, as often we only become aware of an issue when it poses a challenge to us or someone we know. There are four main types of communication: verbal, non-verbal, written, and visual. Each rely on at least one of our senses, and therefore it is true that there is scope for a significant number of barriers to exist when communicating. If we have awareness of the variety of barriers that exist, then we can ensure that we provide a variety of modes of communication. In doing so, we provide options for navigating the following barriers and opportunities to enable those with different needs or preferences. Do a quick check. Without using your hands, how easy is it to navigate your organization's website? Or close your eyes and then try to use the website. Barriers to communication do not only exist because of format, but also as a result of the environment. Physical barriers can refer to environment in terms of how areas are marked out or set up within the workspace. For example, big open plan areas can inhibit a worker with a hearing impairment's ability to interact because there is too much noise. Also, when discussing physical barriers, we need to be aware of the method of communication, as if someone has a disability such as dyslexia, then it could well be that they do not favour written communication, so have other types available. Cultural or attitudinal barriers can be limiting to an individual based on perceptions and prejudgments. Due to a lack of exposure to difference, it's true that sometimes a person with a disability might not be invited to a communication exchange because it is assumed that they don't have an opinion or the relevant experience. Language barriers can be challenging for a number of reasons. If we have a different mother tongue, then sometimes words or phrases can get lost in translation or not have the same meaning. But also, much is communicated without spoken words, via body language. This in itself can pose challenges. How often do you react to the way someone has looked at you, or their posture? Those with physical impairments might not have the function to be as expressive as people expect. Those with invisible disabilities could be experiencing pain or discomfort, which impacts their movement. Those with visual impairments likely won't detect the inferences and cues that gestures provide. As a result, they either retreat from interaction for fear of interjecting at an inappropriate moment, or, inversely, speak over others and be judged as rude or inappropriate. Finally, for now, for those who are not neurotypical, there might be other factors that impact the way they interact, as their brains pick up on stimulus that most wouldn't even notice, and they can feel as though they are dealing with a lot of noise, which can then also present environmental barriers. Head to the exercise files for an activity that can give a sense of how this can make an individual feel. I've also included a list of some examples of what all these experiences are like to help give you a better sense of the specific impact on your day-to-day life. To conclude, make it a priority to notice the various elements involved in your day-to-day communications and recognize what adaptations might be required to make them inclusive for your audience. We've already touched upon the potential for numerous barriers to accessibility to exist: architectural, communication, organizational, and technology. But now we will look at the physical practicalities of these. When designing, assessing, or renovating a workspace, there are many different elements to consider, and we should ensure that we consult with a group that has representation of a diverse range of needs. It can be very useful for those with visual impairments to use contrasting surfaces to differentiate zones within a work area. For example, tile to carpet when moving from the elevator area to the workspace floor, or from carpet to wood when moving to the refreshment station. It can be extremely beneficial to have work zones with different ambiances, specifically for those with sensory impairments, but again, not limited to just those individuals. The option to work in a quiet zone or solitary booth could be one employee's nightmare, but another's idea of paradise. These preferences aren't always static, which is why it's important for it to be an available option, not a permanent request or adjustment. Similarly, it is beneficial to have areas with different lighting options, as some disabilities can have sensory reactions to bright lights. Some light types can cause fitting, and those with visual impairments can either require very targeted light or, equally as likely, require minimal light not to get dazzled. When you are distributing information to your employee network via video clip or including such material in presentations, then it's a very good idea to use subtitles, as this could enable someone with a hearing impairment to follow the content, but also enable other team members to watch it either in a noisy location or at a time when they were unable to use the sound. In areas where there is a one-way system implemented or stairs and ramps present, ensure that there is a means of support on both sides of the track. For example, railings on the left and right-hand sides. Many individuals with neurological impairments, disabilities that affect balance, or those that have invisible disabilities, are often impacted in more than one limb or part of the body, and so need options to stabilise. In this instance, it is classic on the London Underground that you stand on the right-hand side of an escalator and allow people to walk on the left-hand side. I only have adequate function in my left hand to stabilise myself and therefore have to stand and face in the opposite direction of travel in order to decrease my risk of falling. It is not ideal and indeed not possible for everyone, so it is important to have options. The idea of flexible start and finish times is often seen as a novelty or feared that it might encourage a more relaxed work ethic. However, the practicalities of implementing such an approach is that it can remove the anxieties experienced by having to travel during rush hour, meaning that less energy is spent battling through crowded areas, which in turn means that more energy can be put into actually performing one's job. Technology can bridge the gap between the impossible and what is possible, and thankfully there are plenty of options available. If compatibility with the user is not considered, then it can be wasteful, both in terms of energy and resource. An example of this can be elevator installation. There are some elevator types that require the user to hold the button in order to operate the lift, but not everyone has the strength, range of movement, or dexterity to do so. So whilst an elevator technically solves the problem of navigating stairs, if it is not chosen with a design and function in mind to suit the user's needs, then it does not enable independence or remove a barrier without creating a new one. Isolation in the workplace environment centers around the concept of segregation, separation, and exclusion. Often, a worker with a disability finds themselves making a decision, disguised as a choice, in order to avoid awkwardness, being singled out, or being labelled as a problem. We want to raise awareness of instances in which such behaviour might occur so that we can eliminate the need to view isolation as the safe option for an individual and ensure that we are not forcing such a situation. Isolation can be experienced as a result of communication barriers that have been explored in previous videos, and simply from not being included in the receipt of information because of how it is distributed, such as not having access to a certain channel. It is also important to note when engaging external partners that they consider the compatibility of their communication platforms too. This leads particularly well into consideration when it comes to planning team events, celebrations, or social activities for the workforce. We need to be aware of an individual's needs or circumstances to ensure that we aren't creating unnecessary barriers. This is especially important in the instance of those with invisible disabilities, as we cannot rely on a visual stimuli as a reminder of the need for consultation. Timings for events or activities could exclude some workers from participation. For example, an employee may have routine commitments to treatment, such as physiotherapy or dialysis for a kidney treatment, that enable them to function optimally daily but has no relevance to their workday and therefore isn't widely known. In this situation, it would always be useful to do a poll of a variety of day and timing options so that everyone has the freedom to indicate their availability and preferences. As is good practice for inclusion generally, it is wise to implement a variation of time slots for a series of events to ensure that the same individuals aren't excluded each time. In roles or activities involving travel, it is important to select venues that don't exclude individuals or segregate them from the wider group project or experience, either through their direct accessibility or the way in which one can get there. By making a variety of options available to remove unnecessary barriers, we will open up opportunity and avoid people having to decline involvement and isolate themselves. Being aware of an individual's requirements can be vital when it comes to food. We now have increasingly more awareness to food intolerances and allergies, but the same considerations need to be made for workers with invisible disabilities. Often a gesture to welcome someone new, show gratitude, or celebrate success involves food or a fancy restaurant. But we should really consider the preference of the individual in question. For example, someone who is not neurotypical might have a routine of eating the same thing at the same time for lunch every single day, and despite best intentions to reward or treat them, we might be forcing them to avoid and isolate rather than engage in the arrangement or risk causing offence. We should always ensure that these details are addressed prior to circulation of details to the wider environment, so that changes don't have to be made due to oversights. For example, a restaurant has been booked that doesn't have wheelchair access and so has to be cancelled due to the inaccessibility for a team member who requires such access. That individual could then become the target of resentment. This can also lead to isolation. If the community feel that they have been deprived an opportunity because of an individual, even if it isn't their fault.